On the 4th of November 2020, SARS employee Benneth Mathebula was served with a disciplinary notice in order to answer to allegations of dishonesty. This after he called in sick, only to be seen on television by supervisor at an EFF protest. This was in Sandton. Mathebula was found guilty and therefore dismissed on the 24th of March 2021. Well, Mathebula referred his dismissal to the CCMA, where it found that his firing had been substantively unfair. However, the Labour Court has overturned an arbitration ruling that Mathebula should keep his job. Well, Labour analyst Tony Healy joining us now to give us insight on this intriguing story. Tony, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time. So, the CCMA initially ruling in favour of Mr. Mathebula, but this has now been overturned, and I suppose let's start with the differences in the two judgments. Why did the CCMA say it had found in his favour?
Well, good morning and good morning to the viewers. Well, the CCMA in short said that because the employee had a valid medical certificate, he qualified for sick leave and to be booked off work and not to be considered to have been absent without leave. The Labour Court says, no, not at all. You have a medical certificate that says you're unfit for work. And if you're unfit for work, that means you're unfit also, as the judgment said, to, for example, be clapping and singing at a public protest in support of a political party, which I think was the right call.
So let's talk about the basics then, Tony. When you are sick, or let's say you are on sick leave, are you confined to your home? Is that what your employer expects of you? Can you not be seen elsewhere?
No, you can. You're not necessarily bed-bound or home-bound, but you can't be engaging in activity that would suggest that your medical certificate is in fact incorrect. There's been previous cases, for example, where an employee was found to have been fishing whilst on sick leave, and that was considered to be okay because it was kind of viewed to be a therapeutic exercise in relation to the illness that was diagnosed in that particular case. Zoli, the problem is, in my view, in my rough estimation, approximately half of all medical certificates are fraudulent. I'm dealing right now with a case where 5 employees pleaded guilty to purchasing medical certificates and presenting them to their employer. And this is, I think if any reasonable-minded person looks at this case and says, you know what, you have an employee who says I'm sick and unfit for work, and on that very day is seen clapping and dancing and singing and participating in, fairly, physical activity as one does in a protest scenario, then I think most people would agree. If you can't be that sick if you can behave in that way.
Yeah. And you just spoke about 5 fraudulent sick certificates or sick notes that you're saying that people went out there and bought. What lessons should be drawn from cases such as this one that we're talking about in regards to honesty about being on sick leave?
Well, the unfortunate part is, Zoli, is that, and this really is the truth in my view, you have to view pretty much every medical certificate with some degree of circumspection, and employers should be confirming these and validating these because there's an extraordinary amount of sick leave fraud in this country. And I think employers would be amazed at the various schemes that are available. I mean, you have admin staff and reception staff in doctors' practices, taking pads of script, pads of scripts and dishing them out at locations or localities for 50 rand a time and what have you. So if you're an employer, unfortunately, one has to view sick certificates with a degree of circumspection. and validate them more often than the average employer does.
It does appear, Tony, that the ultimate price that's been paid by this worker, who obviously was employed by SARS, it does appear that the consequence was ultimately a dismissal. Does SARS, do you think that this is a drastic step? And importantly, what do labor laws say about dishonesty? Does it carry the weight of being dismissed from work?
Well, in most cases, yes. There are cases of less serious, if you like, acts of dishonesty, which would not necessarily justify dismissal. But if you look at a case like this, and really when it comes to any fraud of this nature, because that's really what it is, it's a premeditated, conscious act of dishonesty and fraud. And we mustn't forget that it unjustly enriches the employee. Because remember, the employee is being paid sick leave for this day. So in this particular day, this employee knew about the protest action, came up with a scheme to, in a premeditated way, to plan and execute a deceptive act of producing a medical certificate, knowing full well that he wasn't sick. Knowing full well that the employer would be financially prejudiced in having to pay him 1 day's pay, sick pay for that day, fully knowing this. So to answer your question, when you have kind of conscious, premeditated fraud that unjustly enriches an employee at the expense of the employer, then that's absolutely, going to be a fair dismissal.
Yeah. Final question to you, Tony. Could a case like this be appealed in any court? Particularly, if I just bring this to your attention, particularly if the sick note only describes the nature of the illness as, and I quote, absence due to a medical condition. It doesn't explain much, does it?
Yes. Look, in fairness, many medical certificates say medical condition for the reason of wanting to maintain the ailment, the confidentiality of the ailment. There'll be ailments that you and I might have that we don't want our employer to be aware of, quite understandably. So there's nothing especially wrong with that wording. But to answer your question, any labor dispute at the labor court can be taken to the Labor Appeal Court, it can be taken thereafter to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and even ultimately to the Constitutional Courts. It's not necessarily the end of the road, but it's unlikely, in my view, that this matter will go to the Labor Appeal Court, but it quite possibly could.
Labor law expert Tony Healy, thank you very much for your time. Well, there is your warning. Don't lie. And I suppose that's the lesson here. Do not lie to your employer.